us on to item 8, which is this is a public hearing. It's Truth and Taxation Annual Hearing.
So Mayor and council members, this is going to be something that you've already seen, so this might be a little boring to you. But part of the whole budget process each year, especially for establishing our tax levy, is that we have to go through a very specified process set out by state statute. So the first process we did back in the last meeting of September, which is establishing the preliminary levy. Those levies then are taken from each jurisdiction and put on your preliminary tax statement, which was sent out to people just a couple of weeks ago, that both indicated what the change in each jurisdiction's levy would have on your overall taxes, but also then gave people the ability to, or notified them of this meeting tonight in case they had any questions or comments or concerns based on that. So I thought Uderman was here for a second to
No, he was here for Barbara.
No, so this is the, one of the things that we're required to do is to have a public hearing that basically lays out what our proposed tax levy is. We cannot adopt the levy tonight. We have to just accept any comments and then move on to the December 16th meeting is when we actually consider doing this. So since you guys have seen this, I'll zip through it. We're going to talk about our CIP program and projects we have next year. Our tax levy policy, and then our staffing study results. Our objectives for a 5-year have been something that we based our budget on for the last several years, and really sort of get back to how do we end up meeting our mission of being the best small town in Minnesota, and how do we have our service levels and resources for those service levels set to be able to meet that mission. So our budget environment for this year, we've seen property values continue to modestly increase since the end of the last recession. The increase for 2019 for taxes payable 2020 actually is the largest increase we've seen for quite some time, 9.14%, with 1.35% of that growth coming from new growth. We practically see no local government aid anymore, which I'll explain how that's impacted us going from when we lost it. Our building permits have continued to remain strong, especially with residential, but we haven't seen as much commercial industrial because we're running out of land. That'll change as we open up the interchange property up there, but it does reduce the amount of financial impact that the building permits have when it's mainly focused on residential. We're steadily seeing our population continue to increase. Our electric usage has continued to go up significantly, and we continue to have a good balance of development in the community. So this gives a breakdown for 2020. You can see 9.14% here is the overall increase. In the residential, we saw a 9.09% increase. 7.67% of that was an existing property. So the average home out there saw their property value go up by about 7.67%. The largest increase we saw was in apartments, which we saw a 15.56% increase. 12.44% of that is in existing properties, which means that we still have a very high demand for apartment units within the community. This is a breakdown of how that breaks out into different categories. Commercial industrial is 14%, residential 72%, apartments are 13%, and other is like ag property that's undeveloped is about 1%.
How is, not to kind of jumping a little bit, Jonathan Flats, have they filled, or where are they at?
I think we heard they were at
40%.
That's the last we heard.
That's the last we heard, which was a few weeks ago.
What was that?
40%?
40% vacancy.
40% occupancy.
Occupancy.
Yep.
Well, that's odd, because I remember when we were there, they said that they were like halfway filled, and they were hoping to be filled, but by this time.
I don't know that we're actually working with the guy who did that. Is really seeing success there, and to the point where he's actually looking at doing another project in town. So he's viewing their rate of occupancy as being pretty positive right now.
Apparently that's fairly normal.
A few weeks back that we got the 40% number, so
yeah.
I'm sure it's changed. Yeah.
And I just asked because that's the newest apartment building I can think
Yep.
of, and because I know that apartment wants are way higher than most cities have available. So that's why I was kind of curious how that was moving along.
Yeah, he seems to be very pleased with it because he's interested in doing another project, so. So our market values, this shows where our growth has gone. Over time, you can see basically when the recession started and then it went down, which was the first time that I know of in recent history that our property values actually went down. It took until 2016 to actually get our property values back from when the recession happened.
See
So
that big dip? That's just when I started.
right
What
there.
does that tell you?
That was the low point of the community, 2010. No.
But it's only gone up from there.
That's right.
But you can see we've rebounded nicely now, and this is assuming a 2% growth going into the future. We've actually seen an average of about 5.46% increase. So we would expect, unless something really changes, to see that continue to go up. This is something I like to point out, that even during those recession times, those low periods of 2010 in time here, that
Remember, you were here too.
yeah, I know. Even
And
during
Luke.
even during those times,
And
we
Noah.
saw growth in the community, which was really positive. And then the annual new growth as far as value, almost $70 million in new construction growth in 2017, get to $50 million in 2018, and about $40.5 million in 2019. So our value is, as far as the amount of new value has changed, but that's been mainly because it's been more residential than commercial
So
industrial.
the dip is purely commercial industrial?
It's a lack of land. In fact, we were just talking about this today, that if you've seen up on Halasik's old property, where the nursery used to be,
Yeah.
they have now sold out on that, and that was a really difficult site to work with, which to me indicates how much demand there is for industrial property. We are in discussions now with the property owners out at the interchange, and they are very eager to move forward next summer with opening up some more industrial land out there. Local government aid, so 2000, between 2004 and now, basically we've seen $1 million decrease. Quite frankly, I think this is where we started to have the biggest issues with our staffing shortages, is that we absorbed $1 million hit. We didn't lose staff, but we weren't able to gain staff as the community continued to grow. We sort of fluctuated back and forth, but right now we're at $14,000 we get from the state for local government aid. So pretty much nothing, and that's how we expect it to continue into the future. As far as expected building permit revenue, we are trying to be more conservative, since we're still looking at primarily residential next year. And so we brought our number for budgeting purposes down to $900,000, which is a decrease of about $300,000 from where we budgeted last year, just because we just don't think we'll see the values in residential that we do in commercial industrial for next year. So we want that to be a little bit closer to that.
So will that change now with the project, by the school there, that commercial project? And what was the other commercial project we just approved? Wasn't there 2 commercial projects we approved at the last meeting?
Well, there was one industrial building that was a concept approval, which is right next to the school. So that's more of an office
Yep.
industrial building.
But there was.
Oh, and then there's also the office next to the dental
Yeah,
building.
off the,
Oh, yep,
Yep.
that's what it
And,
was.
you know, if
But
the.
we
if-
added on to the one right on 41 there.
Yep,
American Flexible.
American Flexible Products.
Expansion.
It wasn't it's a huge expansion for them. It wasn't a huge expansion
That it
compared
would
to some
change
of the
those
big ones.
numbers?
And the ones like the one up by the dental clinic, those are more built like residential, so their values are more like a bigger residential home.
Okay.
So our population, we have adjusted it to be, we've seen the last couple of years be more like 120 new units, and so we've adjusted a little bit to sort of show where we think we'll be at the end of this 5-year period. So in 2020, we expect we're going to be right around 27,000 residents. and that we increase by about 1,300 to 1,500 residents by the end of this 5-year planning period. Now, that could completely change now that the interchange is open, because I do expect that a lot of that residential property is going to start to pop real quick now. So we have, we call this a franchise fee, but it's a 10% electric transfer to our general fund. This is something that's grown pretty significantly over the years. So 10% of our profits go as a franchise fee from the electric fund to our general fund. You can see in 2020, that's going to be about $4 million that will come to the general fund, and is a pretty significant part of our overall general fund budget. It ends up being about 30% of it. So major discussion items. First one is a staffing study. This comes out of our 2017 council department head retreat, where we really recognized that there was a need to understand the staffing shortages that we had. And so from that came out of that hiring our financial consultant to do a staffing study to really sort of look at two things: look at any gap in current employment that we currently have, but then also looking at what do we need to do to prepare as we go out to full development. And so the two findings they had there was that we are about 16 employees short now, and that we needed to plan for an additional 57 employees between now and full development. The future employee breaks down to about 2.86 employees per year, which actually is a little bit slower of a rate of bringing on new employees than we've seen the last 20 years. So that sort of matches up with what type of pace we would expect to see anyway. And what we try to do there is to capture the new growth that comes in to be able to add those positions as we move forward. So the different areas that we had for the gap currently they identified, the biggest one is in our building maintenance. And that's the one that we have about, we have no building maintenance department now. We do it sort of piecemeal based on different buildings, and we don't have a centralized one, which really impacts our ability to have something that's putting the same resources and the same methodology and everything towards every building that we have, so that we have some consistency in how we take care of buildings, that we have some expertise on staff. We end up having to contract out a lot of the stuff like HVAC and roofing and all that type of stuff now, which gets expensive, and also helps with some of the things that we do with consolidating our purchasing too for the different supplies that we have in buildings. So as we talked about back during the preliminary tax levy process, when we established that, really the plan that we laid out was not to do fill the gap in 1 year, but look at this over a 4-year period. And that really the total gap was about $2 million, $1.5 million of that coming from the general fund, so tax levy supported, and $500,000 coming from the enterprise funds. And to reach that $1.5 million gap over the 4 years would require a $375,000 additional levy increase each of the 4 years to be able to make that up. So this is a plan very similar to how we implemented our capital improvement program a few years ago, where we identified we had about $1 million gap, and we basically took off $250,000 a year up to 2017, and now we have a fully funded program where each year we can schedule $1 million of improvements to do to our existing assets. We've talked about this, just sort of indicating where our community is at. Value of city services is the highest it's been at 87% right now. Very positive ratings for each of our services within the community. That people prioritize, especially the basic services that we have, but really see some importance in really all the services that we provide. There are certain services that they particularly support increasing funding on to make sure that they stay properly funded. at the very least maintain. The ones that we see people focus on cutting are typically the ones that are more discretionary. So it might be the town course or community center. Now, as we've talked about, those are not property tax levy supported entities. They're supported by the users that actually use them. So they're not ones that generally impact our tax levy. And then, the big one was talking about maintaining our services and would people support a property tax increase to maintain services? And really what we're talking about here is not increasing services, it's really properly staffing to be able to maintain the services that we have over time. And you can see here that 68% of our residents supported increasing property taxes if that meant maintaining the service levels that we have. So if we implemented the first phase of the staffing study for 2020, we'd really be focusing first and foremost on that building maintenance division to get that up and going. So we'd have 3 positions of the 6 that would be for next year. Water and sewer maintenance worker would be the one enterprise one that we had already planned for and talked about at our last work session, but we had already planned for in the past. And then having $125,000 that would go towards funding our actual budget for building maintenance activities.
I want to make one comment on that slide.
Yep.
That it does say wage and benefits, that's not
Yes.
salaries.
That
of
is
those
not salaries,
individuals.
that is wage and benefits.
Just because I know there's maybe a miscommunication there prior.
Asked that before,
I
I was gonna clarify that as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, it is.
It is wage and benefits. Yep,
It's a good clarification.
yep. So that's our staffing study and what we recommend for next year. From an operational tax levy policy, so our policy focuses on establishing a levy based on factors that actually impact our cost of services. So that includes the inflationary, the impact of inflation on our expenditures, but also the new growth that directly impacts the cost of services we provide. So as we add new people in the community to provide the same service, we need to have additional resources to be able to do that. So our policy, which we established back in 2014, I believe it was to basically say that we would increase our tax levy on an annual basis based on inflation plus new growth in the community, and that we'd only go beyond that if we had some kind of a new program that we were trying to do, which in this case would be our staffing study, and that would be levied at the amount of the actual cost of that service. So those 3 things together for 2020, so the new growth is 1.35%, inflation is running at 3%, so our tax levy policy would say we'd be at 4.35%, plus our staffing study of $375,000 is an additional 4.04%, which brings our total increase up to about 8.6%, which is less than our tax capacity increase. Our tax capacity increase was 9.7%, which means our tax rate's actually going to go down for next year. So it's under our old policy, we basically levied based on the amount of tax capacity growth we saw in the community. So to keep a constant tax rate, in this case, if we have a 9.7% increase in tax capacity, we'd increase our levy by 9.7% and the tax rate would stay constant. So under our new policy, we actually levy less than what our old policy would have called for. And then finally, our capital improvement programs. This is the $1 million a year that we put back into investing into existing assets. We have a lot of projects next year that we're doing. First of all, the street overlay program, $375,000. That'll be in the Christian Drive and Manuela Drive area will get overlaid. We have $60,000 of seal coating to do. We have not identified the specific project for that yet. Trail upgrades and overlays, we do $60,000 a year, so you can get 1 mile overlaid for $20,000. We have about 75 miles of paved trails out there. So we basically get 3 miles of trails each year repaved with that. We have a new pedestrian bridge on our main trail that needs to get installed. We have some sports courts resurfacing at our parks around the community. Siren number 6 needs to get replaced. Our firewalk station sidewalk replacement is scheduled for next year. We have annual work that needs to be done to our MSB building for $45,000. And the three sort of park-related projects that we have for next year. So Cortina Woods Park rehab is scheduled at $135,000. Clover Hockey Rink rehab is at $70,000. And then Brickyard Lake Pier rehab, so this is the one that's behind Cooper's
We're gonna
down
get
here.
that fixed?
The one
Awesome.
that's heaved up right now, would get replaced at $40,000, which actually goes good with this last year. They did, actually just last few weeks, did the replacement of the whole landscaping wall along there. So those two projects sort of play together.
That, was that ours or was that private?
That was ours.
What happened? Was it given out?
It completely failed. It's been failing.
Oh.
Yeah. It's been failing for a couple of years now.
Is there still gonna be a fountain in that lake?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. The big one.
Little things.
Yeah, it's the big one.
So is, that pedestrian bridge, is that on the new trail off of 41? Is that? Is
No,
that-
that's a different,
That's the
Okay.
total.
yeah.
Why did,
We're working on bringing something back for you on that. That, we don't consider that a capital improvement project because it's new.
okay.
Yeah, we consider that more of a new project, and so we'll be bringing back that project to you to show how that's going to happen.
You know, as we are continuing to grow here, I know that we've added one siren already. Do we, is that something where we have to be adding a new siren before long? Are we pretty good?
We're
shape
pretty
there?
good right now.
Okay.
In fact, thinking of where we place them, I'm not so sure that we're going to necessarily need to place.
Yeah, one that should cover quite a, that.
Yeah, I
quite
mean, we
area, too.
put the new one up in the southwest Chaska, and then we put one up in the Chevelle area too. So until you start to see stuff develop in that McKnight Road area, that might be the only place that
Oh.
still has a hole in it.
Okay.
So the major new things we talked about, the first year of the staffing study implementation, our plan dollars for employee wage and benefit increases. So 2020 is the second year of our 2-year contract for our contract employees. And so that's such a 3% increase in wages and a 6% increase in our employee benefit contribution. We have a cafeteria plan that people utilize. And then this is more just a point. So we had the pay equity study that we did in 2019. That was actually adopted, but we didn't have it part of last year's budget. So this is the first time you'll actually see it in the budget. But basically those recommendations from that pay equity study that was approved last year show up in this year's budget. We fully fund our equipment acquisition, and then all other items remain unchanged. So, you know, basically, let's flip forward to this. The impact so we look at a median value home in 2019 was $260,200. That's median value home in 2020 is $288,900. So that example home would be a $70 increase in taxes, or about $5 per month. Again, given that we've seen a 9.7% increase in our tax capacity, we'll actually see our tax rate go down by 1.59%. And what I always throw this out as a disclaimer: this is an example home. What happens at your home is completely dependent on your value. We just want to give a sense of what would happen to a median value home. And I think the important thing to point out here is we continue to be very low compared to metro area. This is, Chaska's the 7th lowest tax levy per capita. This is comparing to, I had mentioned this back before, they still haven't changed on the Department of Revenue site. They still have 2018 data, and this is our 2020 data. So this is comparing us to city taxes 2 years ago. So I would expect that we're probably at the 82nd mark based on how things have likely changed. Which is exactly the same place we've been, is exactly the same place that we've been for a decade. We really haven't changed our position in that, and not that I'm pointing out, but here's Chanhassen, so. So for 2020, we'll continue to be seventh or eighth lowest, depending on what data you look at. And we continue to have the lowest tax levy per capita in Carver County. This looks at our actual proposed general fund revenues. The big thing I'll point out in this, and I pointed out at the last, when we did the preliminary levy, if you remember, we shifted $355,000 of levy from the EDA into the general fund because that's basically where the impact occurs. So $355,000 of this is actual transfer of the levy from the EDA into here. So it doesn't have any impact on taxpayers because it went down in the EDA by $355,000 too. So if you took that out, we'd have about a 10.1% increase in our actual revenues coming in. So again, we saw the 8.6% increase in our levy, but then we also had things going up like our electric franchise fee, things like that, as far as other revenue coming into there. And then this is probably harder to see, but it wasn't in your packet. It basically shows that the budget would balance for next year and basically where those dollars would go. And then on the right side, I put notes just to sort of indicate if there's changes that are a little bit more major, explaining what those changes are. So, it could be anything from the addition of our new building maintenance people to, in some cases, we shifted positions from one department into another. So you might see one go up a lot, but one go down. So this created sort of the explanation there. So as far as the next stages in the process, this is a truth and taxation hearing. You need to officially open it up as a public hearing, take any comments, and then we'd officially have the action being setting the adopting the final 2020 budget and establishing the final levy at the December 16th meeting. Any
Okay.
questions?